everybody. Welcome to OK Talks. I'm your host, Oliver Kendall. I'm a lifelong political nerd with an academic background in international relations focus and security policy, and real-world experience working in the U.S. domestic political space and living in a number of other countries than my own, all of which combined, I think, positions me fairly well both to interpret for my international audience what's going on in the politics of my own country, and to shed light for some of the folks back home on some events of note going on in the rest of the world. So, in my last episode, I discussed the rising anti-Semitism globally, and especially in the West, in the wake of the Hamas attacks of October 7th, and the resulting war and humanitarian crisis in the Gaza Strip, and addressed how silly it is to think of the whole situation through the lens of being either simply pro-Israel or pro-Palestine. Now, originally, I was planning to also take a look at some of the mistakes being made in the way that the war there is being covered, like how that's shaping the narrative. But I decided in the end that episode was already longer than I wanted it to be, so I ended up keeping my focus in that episode just on things not directly related to the facts of the war in Gaza, and decided to stay more outside the actual Middle East, that is to say, the different ideological lanes of participants in the audience of the conflict and the rising anti-Semitism elsewhere. But I did threaten in that episode to address that other piece in a spin-off, and, well, here it is. I just want to say before getting into any of this, if you have not yet heard episode 63, the rather awkwardly titled Rejecting Anti-Semitism and the Myth of Two Sides in the Israel-Palestine Conflict, yeesh, there's one you couldn't fit on a bumper sticker. If you haven't heard that episode yet, please stop listening to this one and go listen to that first one. It includes context that I think is important to this one, which really should be viewed as part 2 of that episode. So yeah, go listen to that one before you listen to this one. So before I get into the main part of what I want to talk about in today's episode, it would be a little silly to do an episode focused on stuff in the Middle East without first talking a bit about Iran's massive, and yet massively unsuccessful, attack on Israel that took place over the weekend. So just by way of context here, a couple weeks back, the Israelis assassinated a number of the top people in the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is basically the Tehran regime's version of the SS, including the guy who is responsible for coordinating terrorism activities with Iran's various proxies in the region, including Hamas. Now, the Israelis did so with a strike which I believe hit a building that belonged to the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard Corps, next to their embassy in Damascus, in Syria. And although realistically this sort of thing between the Israelis and the Islamic Republic is not exactly without precedent, the Islamic Republic regime, and I should say I'm calling it that on purpose, since I don't want to conflate the regime with the Iranian people, who are really not well represented by and horribly oppressed by that regime. The regime took this assassination of the IRGC people as like a serious affront to their collective pride, and decided to, for once, actually respond militarily themselves to Israel rather than farming it out to one of their proxies. So they launched a couple hundred cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and UAVs, drones, that is to say, at Israel. Now, there are a couple of important things here that can be interpreted in a number of different ways, so I'm going to just lay out some potential conclusions for all this without necessarily taking a clear position myself, because I'm not entirely sure yet what the right interpretations are. Firstly, this attack was telegraphed by the regime in Tehran for a while before it happened. This could be out of a desire to keep things stable, to basically warn that it was going to happen and leave it at that. It could also be out of a desire to basically wage psychological warfare against the Israelis and keep them panicky and on the edge for a while. Secondly, virtually none of the projectiles that were launched actually hit Israel. As of right now, the only casualty that I know of is a Muslim child in Israel who was hit by shrapnel. Now, the reason for this is partly because of Israel's own rather impressive air defense systems, but also because the combined air forces of the US, UK, France, and, critically, Jordan and I think Saudi Arabia helped take down these weapons that the Islamic Republic launched. So there are a lot of both conclusions and questions to draw from this. It would seem to signal that Israel's relationships with state actors in its immediate neighborhood have actually suffered less than might have been anticipated over the last few months. Especially important there is the involvement of the Saudis, as is the statement in the last few days of a Saudi official who basically came straight out and said that he thinks that the Islamic Republic engineered October 7th and the resulting war in Gaza to scuttle the impending normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Now, all this would indicate that process could continue and, I hope, could signal that some of those neighboring regimes might be willing to play a more productive role vis-a-vis the Palestinians, both by helping to keep the peace and rebuild after this latest round of fighting, and, in the long term, by pushing for and helping to create an actual functional country called Palestine based on a realistic two-state agreement rather than just fanning the flames of conflict by keeping alive the genocidal from the river to the sea fantasy that someday Israel will just disappear, the Jews will go away, and that hypothetical Palestine will simply replace Israel. Now, the fact that something like 99% of these projectiles launched to Israel were intercepted colors the question of what comes next. Now, one school of thought, the one very much evinced by the Biden administration right now, seems to be, okay, this attack didn't really do any serious damage in Israel. Take that as a win. Take also the diplomatic coup of the Saudis and Jordanians supporting you as a win, and call it a day. The Islamic Republic regime is also signaling that they're done, so we can put this back in the box, de-escalate, and basically go back to the sort of shadow war that existed before, rather than risking upgrading to a full-blown overt conflict. Another school of thought is, you can't really just take this lying down. I mean, a sort of unwritten rule in the Middle East for several decades now has been that state actors just don't really attack Israel anymore. Various other Middle Eastern countries tried multiple times in the first decades of Israel's existence to attack and push Israel into the sea, and every single attempt was met with devastating consequences for those states. So they kind of stopped. If Israel does not reestablish that deterrence now, it could invite renewed attacks or set a precedent that Israel be encouraged to not respond to stuff like this in the future. Furthermore, the fact that Israel's air defense network managed to stop this first direct attack ever on Israeli soil by the Islamic Republic is kind of irrelevant to the question of whether or not you respond. In fact, although obviously the Iron Dome rocket defense system has saved a lot of Israeli lives over the last decade or two, a lot of Israelis, I think now, think that it was maybe a mistake to set it up in the first place, since it caused a mindset both there and in the rest of the world that they should basically just tolerate rockets raining down on them all the time, rather than do what any other country would do in a situation like this and be like, yeah, no, sorry, you launched rockets at us, we are now coming after you. Okay, let's say that you were walking down the street and a guy shoots you. Now, fortunately, you were prepared and you're wearing a bulletproof vest, so you weren't seriously hurt by the guy shooting you. But in that scenario, do you really just keep walking and not do anything to the guy that shot you? And if you do just keep walking, what's to stop him from shooting you again? In principle, the answer to that question seems fairly easy. But maybe in a context where not responding to that one metaphorical bullet could solve or at least alleviate a whole bunch of other problems, maybe then you consider not shooting back, as would hypothetically be the case right now according to that first school of thought. But on the other hand, the Islamic Republic is basically at the center of all of the chaos in the Middle East right now. And although October 7th may not have been planned in Tehran specifically, well, the people who carried it out have been armed, trained, and directed by Tehran. I'm genuinely torn on this one, and I can see good arguments for both, which is why I am not going to take a hard position on this right now, and rather turn back to what I was originally planning to talk about in this episode. But before I do, if you haven't done so already, be sure to subscribe to the podcast or follow the channel or whatever it's called on whichever platform you listen. And please also remember to hit like and leave a review, and most importantly, share the show with anybody you think might get something out of it. I have a feeling that this episode, like the last one, really is one that makes some points that aren't being made enough, so, you know what to do. Also, as I've mentioned in the last few episodes, I've really been happy to hear from anybody in the audience at oktalkspodcast@gmail.com. So, by all means, if you have ideas for the show, topics you want me to cover, or hate mail, I suppose I should say, after the amount of shit I got from the Death to America, Death to Israel crowd after posting a short version of that last episode on TikTok, well, please feel free to reach out at oktalkspodcast@gmail.com with ideas, topics, or bomb threats. So, to tie back to something from the last episode and bring it around to what I want to talk about today, and again, if you haven't listened to episode 63 of OK Talks, I really do encourage you to go and do so before continuing with this one. So one of the examples of anti-Semitism that we've seen in the West since October 7th that I talked about last week was an event hosted by a teachers' union in Massachusetts, which was put on by a couple of really radically anti-Israel professors, including one who had an op-ed published several weeks after the events of October 7th, in which she was just giddy with excitement over the mass rape, kidnap, and murder of Israeli civilians. At this event, she and her colleagues presented warped views of what anti-Semitism and Zionism are, in a way that I explore more in that last episode, and, critically, encouraged Massachusetts teachers to push this ideology into their curriculums and bring this campaign to delegitimize the very existence of a Jewish state into their classrooms. Now, one of the scariest things for me about this story is the fact that it received so little coverage from let's call it the normal media. As of this recording, I think just about the only outlets besides like a local CBS station and a local newspaper to have picked up this story is the Daily Wire, which is, a right-wing rag. And the problem with that is that this is not like an opinion piece about trans people or some other nonsense that the Daily Wire like made up out of whole cloth. It is coverage of an actual thing that happened. And when the more like mainstream media seems to be uncomfortable reporting this sort of thing, well, that seriously undercuts the credibility of the more professional class of journalists who we really need to be able to rely on to give us all the facts here, particularly in this like specific political moment both in the US and internationally. I mean, just think about it for a minute. Can you imagine for a second what would happen in a scenario where a big academic organization in a red state started pushing for really like problematic propagandistic material that promoted a hardcore ideological agenda at the expense of a certain minority group to be taught in schools? I have to assume that in a scenario like that, I believe that in a scenario like that, most of the national media wouldn't just not cover it. And I don't have to imagine it because it happened. In Florida this past year, remember the whole, yeah, slavery wasn't great, but some people learned valuable skills nonsense that they tried to push in Florida schools? Yeah, that was a fucking travesty. And the national media, rightly, was all over it. And I mean, like, serious, credible news sources, not just fringe left outlets like Jacobin or Salon.com or some other left-wing equivalent of the Daily Wire. No, the Times, CNN, the Post, various other reasonable, normal, trustworthy news outlets rightly covered this travesty in Florida. But if we can't trust them to cover the same sort of thing when it comes from the other side politically, well, that's not a good thing, either for the national debate or for the credibility of these usually reliable news sources that, again, we need desperately to be able to rely on right now. Now, I've sworn up and down on this podcast that I have no intention of becoming a media critic, either an excellent one like, say, a Brian Stelter, or a hack like half the on-air talent at Fox quote-unquote news, or any of the other don't trust the lamestream media, you can only trust me types in the fact-free far-right media echo chamber. I also want to just stipulate that journalism is a tough job, and covering war is probably one of the toughest jobs within the already tough job of journalism. I think a lot of the people doing that work are genuine heroes, or at least badasses who I look up to. But, with all that said, back in episode 56 of OK Talks, I covered some of the mistakes that the media collectively had been making early on in the war in Gaza. And, well, since then, a number of other ones have been committed as well in terms of framing what's going on in this conflict for the large and turbulent and diverse audience which relies on coverage by the press and, critically, as I'll get into more later, by various NGOs to find out what's happening in this, I think it's fair to say, more than any other obsessively observed conflict. So in the last episode, I said straight off the top that trying to catalog every example of skyrocketing anti-Semitism around the world since October 7th would be insane, and I wasn't going to try. Trying to list and pick apart all of the bad coverage of what's happened in the Middle East since October 7th wouldn't be quite as Sisyphean as trying to do that with all the anti-Semitism over the last 6 months, but unfortunately, along similar lines. So in this episode, like the last one, rather than try to comprehensively address everything, I'm just going to mention a couple of examples here and identify what I see as some common denominators. I think it's fair to say that a pretty common theme in coverage mistakes being made vis-a-vis this war in the Middle East has been withholding or burying rather essential context. So one consistent bit of problematic journalism here when it comes to covering the war in Gaza since October 7th has been how frequently reputable news outlets just uncritically report casualty numbers that they've been given by the quote-unquote Gaza Health Ministry, which, PSA for anyone who's not aware, is Hamas. Now, when it comes to these casualty reports, there's been a pattern of casualty lists emerging extraordinarily quickly after an Israeli strike, which, make of that what you will. Also, the numbers Hamas gives to news outlets do not differentiate between civilians and Hamas or PIJ fighters, which is kind of problematic and deeply misrepresentative. I mean, sure, sometimes major news outlets will mention in the fine print that Hamas gave them one number, as though every single casualty in an attack was civilian, but often, news outlets haven't even bothered to do that. Besides the buried context around casualty numbers, I've also noticed a lack of context given when it comes to the strategic, tactical, and importantly, legal realities of events on the ground. So, for example, I just saw a bunch of stories in the New York Times about the chaos and destruction around the Al Shifa hospital. I don't want to just blame the Times. Other outlets may be equally guilty of what I'm about to describe, but I saw the Times coverage right before writing this, so they're taking the hit. Sorry, guys. So, over the last couple weeks, the IDF was involved in intense fighting with both Hamas and PIJ fighters who camped out in this hospital. Now, part of that is the IDF's fault, in my view, for having basically moved south without actually instituting any sort of control over the territory that they'd already taken, but okay. But the coverage of this has been, I would say, I guess, presented in a way where a reasonable person absorbing it without any context would be reasonably outraged. I mean, basically, it looked like, wow, look at all this destruction resulting from Israel fighting here. Not quite an all caps headline saying Israel destroys hospital, but kind of pointing in that direction. Now, the thing is, tactically, this was actually a hugely successful and, for lack of a better word, rather surgical operation. They did not bomb this hospital. Troops went in and killed or captured huge numbers of both Hamas and PIJ personnel with minimal civilian casualties, and they brought doctors along with them to treat the wounded. Then there's the legal aspect. Hospitals are protected under the laws of war. But that protection goes away when a facility is militarized, and Hamas and PIJ clearly chose to do that. I mean, if you make a hospital your base or hideout or whatever, what is the other side supposed to do? All that is to say, legally, the Israelis could have just bombed this building. But rather than doing that and causing a whole bunch of civilian casualties, they put their own soldiers at risk and went in. And all of that is, I think, rather important context when talking about this situation around the Al Shifa hospital. But if the coverage of it so far has mentioned it, well, it's buried deep enough that I haven't seen a whole lot of it. And if I haven't, well, I'm guessing most of the people that are already primed to be justifiably outraged because Israel destroyed a hospital probably haven't either. Related, coverage more broadly of how Israel has carried out this campaign in Gaza gives an impression of an Israel that is almost uniquely callous towards civilians. Bomb first and ask questions later, if ever. Now, nothing that I'm about to say should in any way be taken to minimize the suffering of civilians in Gaza. As I said repeatedly in the last episode, and will do so again here, what's happening in Gaza is unacceptable. It is an unimaginable humanitarian crisis. Furthermore, as I again said in the last episode, there are a number of things that I think Israel should have done and should be doing differently in its handling of this situation, most particularly in terms of getting in aid and giving hope to Palestinians about some option that isn't either Hamas or rubble. I've also seen coverage of some sort of AI system around targeting, which I think we need a lot more answers about. That all being said, however, actual military experts don't seem to agree with the narrative that Israel has been, extra shitty towards civilians, at least in terms of how it's handled the military side of this. I should say I see far less defense of what I consider the straight-up negligence in both controlling territory and distributing aid, and I want to also recognize that there have been a number of horrible incidences like the one with World Central Kitchen a week or two ago in which aid workers have been killed. But in terms of how Israel has handled the military aspect of this campaign, well, John Spencer, who is the chief of urban warfare studies at West Point and personally served 2 tours in Iraq, says, quote, "By my analysis, Israel has implemented more precautions to prevent civilian harm than any military in history, above and beyond what international law requires, and more than the U.S. did in its wars in Iraq and Afghanistan." Unquote. He cites a number of reasons why he believes this to be the case, and well, since I'm already sensing that this episode will be way longer than I realistically want it to be, I'm going to spare the details and instead put the link to one of his articles about this in the episode description. And ultimately, the specific details of why he argues Israel has actually been comparatively cautious vis-a-vis civilians in Gaza is less important to the point that I'm making than is the simple fact that Israel's rather substantial efforts to protect civilians, and the fact that these efforts go, as Spencer puts it, above and beyond what's required by international law and what the U.S. has ever done in any of its wars, really doesn't seem to have entered into the coverage of this war or the resulting narrative. I'm not going to speculate as to why exactly it is that that aspect of the story seems to have been largely left out. But in the same way that context in terms of the legal and tactical realities around that one instance of the Al Shifa hospital seems to have not made its way into the coverage, well, that seems to have happened more broadly as well. Another oft undercovered aspect of this conflict, in my view, has been the rather important context around the ongoing push for a ceasefire in Gaza. But before that temporary ceasefire we had a few months back, and then since that ceasefire fell apart. Now, what we do get is a whole lot of coverage of protesters in the US and other parts of the West demanding a ceasefire. Interestingly enough, the ceasefire now crowd doesn't appear to be too bothered by Iran's massive escalation of the war in the Middle East with their direct strike on Israel over the weekend, but okay, we do get quite a lot of coverage of protesters demanding a ceasefire sometimes, and how that might impact President Biden's re-election chances. But what we don't get is a whole lot of emphasis on why it is that what those protesters claim to want still hasn't happened. Now, a lot of people that are angry at the criticism of Israel lately often point out, you know what, there was a ceasefire on October 6th. And, I mean, they're right, but okay. The more recent one, that ceasefire in this particular conflict and the exchange of prisoners for hostages that we had a couple months back, well, that one fell apart because Hamas stopped releasing hostages. That's it. That's why it fell apart. The end. And in the time since, well, there have been various deals on the table organized by the US, Qatar, and Egypt. All of these deals have, by the way, been ones in which Israel would be expected to release something like 800 tried and convicted prisoners in exchange for like 40 of the hostages that Hamas captured in yet another violation of international law. Hamas is the one turning down those deals. But I think the coverage really kind of just gives the impression, the vibe, one might say, that the fact that they're still fighting in Gaza is, well, it's just because the Israelis feel like it. You know, they want more revenge. I mean, like a little over a month ago, there was a whole lot of public discussion of, boy, I sure hope we can get a ceasefire in place before Ramadan. What was missing from that discussion was the fact that it was Hamas that blew up that deal as well, since surely they noticed that even when they repeatedly refused ceasefire deals, Israel takes the bulk of the blame, and thus ensuring that there were images of fighting going on during Ramadan would be a huge propaganda victory for them. Similarly, tons of coverage was dedicated to the fact of the US blocking earlier ceasefire resolutions in the UN Security Council. Article after article after article about the US doing that, which resulted in outrage and protests, and then, of course, coverage of the outrage and protests. But very little emphasis was given as to why the US was vetoing those resolutions, namely the fact that these resolutions did not call for a release of the Israeli hostages along with the ceasefire deal. And then, when the US introduced a ceasefire resolution which did call for the release of the hostages, it got blocked by the Russians and the Chinese. It's almost like those two countries don't actually give a shit about Palestinian civilians or peace in the Middle East more broadly and are actually just using that situation to create problems for the West. Who'da thunk it? But in any case, that ceasefire resolution, having been blocked by Russia and China with help from Algeria, barely got any coverage at all. And as a result, barely got any attention. In fact, here's some audio from the Ceasefire Now folks protesting outside the Western embassies of Russia, China, and Algeria after those three blocked that particular ceasefire resolution. Sorry, couldn't help it. I should say, of course, when the US later abstained on a different ceasefire resolution and it ended up going through the UN Security Council, well, Hamas celebrated the ceasefire resolution by, you guessed it, launching a whole bunch of rockets at Israeli civilian targets. Something that also, I should say, barely got any coverage at all. For quite some time now, bottom line, the lack of a ceasefire has been specifically because Hamas keeps rejecting ceasefire deals. And that reality has just not broken through. I mean, like multiple times just in my own life, I've been debating people on this who, understandably, again, I agree with them, decry the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, but then just place the blame entirely on the Israelis. Now, in some cases, this has been because they have genuinely bad intentions and are in the third lane of those ideological divisions that I spelled out in the last episode. But in other cases, it's because they were straight up unaware that Hamas had, in fact, rejected multiple ceasefire deals. So I ended up going to find various articles where that little tidbit was mentioned, and they were often just kind of blindsided by that information, which is not a great sign. And this is where I've just got to step back and ask something that I'm probably going to ask some other version of again at other points in this episode. Before I do, let's just stipulate that it is not actually the job of journalists to always advocate for the perceived underdog or necessarily to advocate at all. But even if it was, how is this helpful? I mean, how is consistently, whether intentionally or not, I should say, burying rather important context as to the legality and ethics of how and why this war is still being fought in any way helpful toward the goal of ending it? Like I just made repeated fun over the last couple of minutes of the ceasefire protesters because in all seriousness, I do think some of them are massive hypocrites who want not peace but rather the destruction of the Jewish state. But some, maybe even a lot of them, I believe, probably have genuinely good intentions and just want to see an end to the violence, and I'm totally with them. But as in the cases I described earlier, they often seem to not have a clear picture of why the fighting hasn't ended and how to bring about that ceasefire. Why has the fact that it is Hamas that has blocked all of the ceasefire deals that have been on the table for literally months now not managed to reach people who genuinely want a ceasefire but are directing that call at the Israelis? Like, why could that not be covered more clearly? Like, could people not simultaneously have a more comprehensive and realistic understanding of the context in various of these situations and still genuinely feel like deep concern for Palestinian Arab civilians caught in the crossfire of this horrible conflict? I mean, I do, and I rather doubt that I'm like uniquely capable. There's another related point or two that I want to make in this episode before I move on, specifically from addressing the kinds of mistakes that I think the press has often been making in coverage of this conflict. Before I move on, there are a few honorable mentions, dishonorable mentions, I guess I should say, that I want to throw up on the board. One is the fact that there are right now somewhere around like 100,000 Israeli civilians from the northern part of the country who have been out of their homes for 6 months. I did see, to be fair, over the weekend, a decent bit of coverage of the fact that basically the entire country of Israel had been on lockdown, ready to sprint to a bomb shelter in anticipation of the Iranian attack. But I've really seen very little coverage of the fact that, again, yeah, something like around 100,000 Israelis have been turned into refugees right now because of the rockets coming in from Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, which is kind of a big deal that that virtually never seems to get mentioned. I mean, of course, in saying this, I should also note that there are a lot more Gazans who are displaced right now. I don't mean to compare the situations, but on the other hand, I don't think that's exactly a story that isn't being told. Another dishonorable mention: the Donald Reynolds Journalism Institute at the Missouri School of Journalism elected this year to give its Picture of the Year award to the freelance photographers connected with the Associated Press who tagged along with Hamas during their attack of October 7th. The winning picture features a couple of Hamas terrorists in the back of a pickup truck, basically sitting on and gloating over the half-naked, broken body of Shawnee Luke, one of the girls who was murdered at the Nova Music Festival. Now, I'm a little bit torn on this one, because on the one hand, with so many like gross people trying to deny or whitewash or memory hole the events of October 7th, even though Hamas basically live streamed their mass rape of Israeli women with GoPros. It might be a good thing that this photo reminds people of that attack. Also, war photography is an important part of journalism. But on the other hand, this wasn't a war, it was a terrorist attack. And we know for a fact that the AP appears to have had at least some uncomfortably close working relationships with journalists affiliated with Hamas. There are some live lawsuits going on right now. Further, in the announcement on social media of this photo having won the award, the institute that gave the award first posted an uncensored version of the photo that did not mention Shawnee Luke's name or how she came to be the murdered half-naked trophy of these barbarians in the back of their pickup. I don't know. There are multiple ways to interpret this one, but it looks pretty gross to me. Also, before moving beyond the bit of this episode that's focused just on the press coverage of it all, one thing I haven't mentioned yet here is that a lot of my friends who, well, I won't speculate as to their motives or which of the ideological lanes I laid out in the last episode they belong to, but people who take an unequivocally hard line against Israel. Some of these folks have pointed out what they see as coverage that is insensitive when it comes to the Palestinians, like referring to kids effectively as teens or young adults rather than children, for example. And I want to recognize here that I'm sure that there is some of that. I know there has been some of that in other wars of the last year, certainly in the context of the war on terror, and I'm sure that there are things that I maybe just haven't noticed as much that are along those lines. But although I have no reason to doubt that there is some of that, I think that for the various reasons that I've outlined in the episode up until now, When it comes to like big factual mistakes and preemptive jumps to conclusion, or like disproportionate coverage of certain things and effective burying of others, it feels to me, at least, as though Israel, more often than not, is not the beneficiary of that sort of mistake. The irony is that, in spite of what I just said, there exists a narrative among the hardcore anti Israel types from Lane 3, as I put it in the last episode, and also among many who are people of goodwill, who are just very concerned about the Palestinians and understandably have a big problem with the current Israeli government. There exists a narrative among various people along the ideological spectrum that the Western press is intrinsically biased in favor of the Israelis. And I think this comes from a number of different places. One is that, at least among the hardcore anti Semites in Lane 3, well, conspiracy theories have always been a core part of anti Semitism, and the idea that the Jews control the media certainly fits that mold. Another place that I think that it comes from is just, again, understandable distrust of the Western media in the context of the role that it played in the drumbeat leading up to the catastrophically stupid invasion of Iraq in 2003. A third place, I think that assumption that the media is biased in favor of the Israelis comes from this one I often hear from people who come from countries that do not have a free press. Like, there's sometimes an assumption, again, from people who are used to seeing the media as nothing more than a tool of the government, that because governments in Western countries, especially the US, tend to be supportive of the Israelis, that, well, of course the press based in Western countries must be biased in that direction as well. Now, that, of course, is not actually an accurate assumption in companies like the US and most of our countries, I should say, like the US and most of our Western allies that do have a legitimately free press, but it's easy to see where that assumption comes from, whether or not it's accurate. Again, I would argue that it isn't. I also want to once again recognize, amid all my criticism of the coverage of this war, that, again, as I said earlier, it is not easy to cover a war well. It's even more not easy to do so when it is, as I also said, without a doubt the most obsessively followed conflict on Earth and has been for decades. I mean, right now there are serious conflicts happening in various parts of Africa, not to mention Ukraine, that get a fraction of the coverage and generate a fraction of the outrage as compared to the war in Gaza. This is why, for the most part, I have focused on patterns rather than individual incidents of mistakes by particular journalists or individual situations of bad coverage, with the exception, of course, of episode 56, where I did a massive facepalm over the collective media fuck-up of the hospital bombing that never was. So, moving on here from the press bit specifically, I had intended initially in this episode really to only talk about the media coverage of it all, the sort of mistakes that I'm seeing made fairly consistently by trusted media outlets and how those shape the narrative here. But the reality is that it would be hard to talk about this without mentioning another massive collective of institutions that are heavily involved in shaping the narrative here, which is the various NGOs that get involved in any sort of conflict zone. Now, there's always been a sort of strange situation in terms of how organizations like an Oxfam or a UN or a Save the Children or whatever interact with this situation in Israel and the Palestinian territories specifically. A great piece in The Atlantic from back in 2014 by a former Associated Press reporter looks at the sort of incestuous relationship between the foreign press and NGOs in Israel-Palestine, which is even more relevant today than it was 10 years ago when it was first published. It is a fascinating and instructive piece, and I will link to it also in the description. The thing here is that because a lot of the Palestinian territory that should one day, and I wish already were, a Palestinian state is either under a military occupation by Israel, or in the case of Gaza, controlled by a terrorist organization, both of those things pending an eventual two-state deal, a lot of the services that would ordinarily be provided by a government are managed by international NGOs, which almost by definition don't receive quite as much scrutiny from the press as a government would. That fact, and the fact that the NGOs are given by the press a lot more space than a government would be to opine without pushback, is accentuated by a symbiotic relationship with the press as laid out in that Atlantic article. Also, since Israel, flawed though it certainly may be, is at the end of the day a democracy, well, they're probably not going to kick out the International Rescue Committee headquarters in Tel Aviv if the IRC criticizes them, which means that these NGOs can operate in this conflict zone, or at least the parts under Israeli control, far differently than they would in many others, in the sense that they can basically take an aggressive position against the government hosting them in addition to just doing service provision without serious, or maybe I should say without systematic fear of reprisal. Now, have there been horrible examples of situations where they, that is to say the NGOs, have been attacked in this particular war zone? Yes. I absolutely don't want to minimize that. The tragedy with the World Central Kitchen workers recently is just one example, and unfortunately, there definitely are more. But in fairness, there is no evidence that I'm aware of that the tragic strike on the WCK workers was driven by some sort of desire to attack the organization or reprisal for something or anything other than bad intelligence. The IDF since then has apologized, has investigated the incident, and has taken disciplinary action against those who are responsible, which looks a whole lot more like the US's response when we accidentally wiped out a team of Doctors Without Borders personnel in Afghanistan due to faulty intelligence than it does to, say, the Russians' systematic campaign to deliberately bomb aid workers in Syria and hospitals in Ukraine, and then kick those NGOs out of Russia itself, or presumably what would happen if the NGOs took a harder line against Hamas when they're also trying to operate in parts of Gaza controlled by Hamas. Bottom line, operating as an international NGO in the Israel-Palestine conflict specifically looks a lot different than it does in most others, for a number of reasons which, I think, affect the way a lot of those organizations communicate around the situation. Now, none of that is to criticize these NGOs, although I'm about to criticize one of them. These organizations do great work, critically important work, but the unique dynamic of this conflict, I think, affects the way in which some of them sometimes communicate here. Which brings me back to the point about narrative shaping. And although there are a number of things I could discuss in this context, I'm going to just zero in instead on the truly gross thing Amnesty International just did. So this last week, a guy named Walid Dhaka died in an Israeli prison. Here's how Amnesty responded to that event on Twitter. Quote, "The death in custody of Walid Dhaka, a 62-year-old Palestinian writer who is the longest-serving Palestinian prisoner in Israeli jails after 38 years of imprisonment, is a cruel reminder of Israel's disregard for Palestinians' right to life." Okay, but Walid Dhaka was in prison because he and a group of militants that he led kidnapped a 19-year-old Israeli soldier, held him prisoner, and while doing so, gouged out his eyes, castrated him, tortured him in various other ways, and ultimately shot him and dumped what was left of his body in the woods. I mean, the way Amnesty framed this on Twitter, you'd think the guy was like a peace activist, arrested for his writings and then murdered in prison like he's Alexei Navalny, when in reality, he started writing when he was in prison, and he died of cancer, for which I believe he was being treated. Now, I mean, to be fair, sure, medical conditions in prison are probably not quite ideal, so maybe, arguably, the guy should have been given some sort of qualified release to get better medical treatment, which Amnesty was pushing for. But as many smart people as I'm sure work at Amnesty International, couldn't they have come up with an argument for that didn't require blatantly misrepresenting the situation? I mean, to the point of straight up slander? Now, in fairness to Amnesty, they did mention in the 10th paragraph of their lengthy press release about how unfair it was that Walid Dhaka had to serve the entirety of the life sentence to which he had been convicted. Yeah, in the 10th paragraph of that release, they mentioned that an Israeli soldier had been, abducted and killed, as they put it, leaving out the more distasteful bits. And I just again, I'm brought back to that question that I asked a few minutes ago. How is this helpful? How does this help anybody? How does demonizing the Israelis on false pretenses bring us any closer to a settlement that will help the Palestinian people? How does it incentivize the Israeli justice system to treat prisoners fairly if, even when they basically meet the standards set by other democracies, giant multinational NGOs will make it sound like they hung the guy up by his thumbs and beat him to death with rubber pipes? And furthermore, how does one of the world's premier human rights advocacy organizations shredding its credibility here help human rights advocates anywhere in the world to do their jobs? I mean, the next time that I need to try to convince one of my friends, in the Philippines, say that Rodrigo Duterte, the former president there, was awful, well, it's going to be a lot harder for me to just turn around and cite a report from Amnesty International about how many extrajudicial killings there were under Duterte, when I now know that Amnesty is apparently willing to basically just make shit up out of whole cloth because they have an axe to grind with the Israelis. I mean, how is this helpful? Or put another way, how would advocating for these things in a way that was more honest be less helpful? I don't have a good answer. To bring this back to the broader point of mistakes in the coverage of this conflict and the way that they shape a narrative that I think is often, Well, a narrative that oversimplifies a complex reality on the ground. I understand, but covering this in a way that is more focused on context and less on, let's say, pathos, is directly disincentivized in today's media environment where revenue is basically tied to clicks, and even more so in the fundraising environment in which big NGOs operate, wherein people are a lot more likely to donate if they're shocked and outraged than they are if they're just discouraged by the complexity and intractability of a terrible conflict. I get that. I get both of those things. I also get that a lot of journalists, and certainly the sort of NGOs involved in this conflict, often tend to have the usually admirable instinct to stand up for the perceived little guy, which, whatever else you may think of Hamas and the Palestinians more broadly, they both certainly are in this specific conflict zone. Now, of course, if you understand Hamas as being part of a broader project driven by the Islamic Republic regime in Iran and its proxies, and other global forces bent on the delegitimization and ultimate destruction of the Jewish state, it becomes less clear that Israel is always the Goliath in this whole equation, but okay. The thing is, there are costs to the fact that a decent bit of the coverage of this conflict has been subpar, and that the information getting out to the rest of the world has been partial at times, in multiple senses of that word. I'll just take a quick look at several of those costs here before we wrap up the episode. So, it's almost certainly made the anti-Semitism problem that I described in the last episode worse, for two reasons. First, because not choosing to cover stuff like that teachers union event that I mentioned earlier gives the impression that that sort of thing is not actually a big deal, which creates a permission structure for other expressions of anti-Semitism in the West. Second, because, well, in a phenomenon that is itself anti-Semitic and driven by both far-left figures and by far-right creeps like Donald Trump repeatedly implying that Jews in the West have a dual loyalty, well, driving outrage toward Israel tends to lead to increased attacks on Jewish populations living elsewhere. Perhaps Yoda put it best, anger leads to hate. Coverage that does less to create context and understanding and more to create outrage also undercuts the chances for peace in the long term. Back in episode 56, I presented basically a case study of how a specific collective media fuck-up just a few weeks into the conflict made the situation way worse. I'm referring, of course, to the totally botched, rushed coverage around an explosion in a hospital parking lot in Gaza, which was falsely reported in a bunch of outlets as basically Israel bombs hospital, 500 dead, which resulted in massive protests across the Middle East and various Arab leaders who were set to meet with Biden, who was at that very moment flying over there, canceling on him, which totally undermined the early efforts to bring the fighting to a halt. Of course, it turned out the next day that the hospital was largely fine. The explosion and resulting fire were not in the hospital itself, they were in the parking lot. Orders of magnitude fewer people had been killed than was originally reported, and it wasn't actually an Israeli strike that had caused the explosion. It was a malfunctioning Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket that they'd tried and failed to launch at Israel. By the time this information came out, of course, the political damage of that initial blown coverage was already done. The massive protests had already happened, and as a result, the Arab leaders Biden was supposed to meet with had already bailed. Naturally, the rather feeble semi-retractions in the press a few days later didn't get nearly as much attention as the initial headlines, which I think really did rather a lot to shape the early views of the conflict, and I have friends who to this day continue to believe that that hospital was blown to pieces by an IDF airstrike. In the broader scheme of things, coverage that inflames the spectators of this conflict does little to lower the temperature to a point where a critical mass of people will be more interested in how we move forward together toward peace than in who we should be angry at right now. I mean, the number of people casually and incorrectly throwing around the word genocide these days, well, that's not a good thing. Because besides the basic unfairness of that narrative spreading around when it is not true by the legal definitions and according to the International Criminal Court, its spread also actively undercuts efforts toward peace. Since, how are you supposed to make peace with a government that's engaged in a literal genocide? I mean, the thing that people who ordinarily support peace efforts tend to believe is the worst crime imaginable. I mean, in order for peace to be achieved here, the participants in this conflict need to be pushed by the spectators of this conflict to stop fighting. And spreading a narrative that there is a literal genocide going on is like the opposite of how you do that. Now, for the record, I don't want to blame the media in general for the fact that the Israel is committing genocide narrative has taken off. I don't think that that is entirely or collectively the media's fault. But an emphasis on coverage that's more about pathos than creating context, well, doesn't exactly help with that. Also, as I mentioned earlier, because I can never forget my sense of impending dread about the upcoming elections in the US this year, in which we really, really need to preserve the credibility of our most trusted media institutions, well, bad reporting on both the war and the related events actively undercuts public faith in the fourth estate. I know I will never look at a New York Times headline quite the same way after that previous little case study I discussed in episode 56. And I know a lot of other people who, like me, are left of center, who have always trusted and would like to continue to trust the mainstream media and think good journalism is critical to being an effective democracy, well, feel the same way. Finally, and I promise this will actually be the last point that I make in this longer than usual episode, reporting on this conflict in a way that places a higher premium on providing the whole story and necessary context than it often seems to these days, well, that wouldn't take anything away from or diminish what the people of Gaza are suffering through right now. Acknowledging that what's going on there does not actually meet the definition of the word genocide specifically does not mean that it's not an absolutely horrible situation, a completely unacceptable humanitarian crisis. Not relying on incomplete information or overly simplistic or straight up false narratives about the conflict does not mean that we shouldn't mourn the loss of so many Palestinian civilians, or that we shouldn't push the Israelis to be even more careful, or that we shouldn't push the Israelis to do a far better job caring for civilians in the areas of Gaza that they now control, and especially to let in more aid, because, well, there have been very credible stories of delays in aid coming in due to reasons that don't seem to rise to the level of being worthy of it having been blocked. Or that we shouldn't push for the eventual outcome here of a fair settlement resulting in a two-state solution. But as I said earlier, we need the spectators of this conflict to be pushing the participants, especially the ones who keep turning down ceasefire deals, toward putting their weapons down, not egging them on. Coverage that prioritized the whole truth, context over pathos, well, that would give people a better understanding of the problem. Problems don't usually get fixed without being properly understood, and this is one problem we should really fucking want to fix. That's it for this episode of OK Talks. If you like the show and want to make sure not to miss the next episode, which I sincerely hope will be less convoluted and depressing, hit subscribe or follow the show on whatever platform you listen, or shoot me an email at oktalkspodcast@gmail.com to be added to the email list. If you really want to do me a favor, be sure to like the show and leave a review, and most importantly, share it with anybody you think might get something out of it. To those who already have, thanks. To those who will, thanks in advance. Thanks as always to Nate Wright for having designed the podcast artwork, and to everyone else for listening.